iDS Talks is a podcast dedicated to helping corporations and law firms find new and effective ways to leverage data, giving them a decisive advantage both in and out of the courtroom.
Hello, and welcome to another edition of iDS Talks. My name is Jonathan Sachs, Chief Revenue Officer at iDS, and I'm joined today by Mike Perelman, a director at iDS based out of the Northeast. We're here today to talk about large-scale forensic preservations. Mike, welcome to the podcast.
Thank you. It's good to see you again.
Yeah, not our first time here.
Our first time.
Don't have to go through your background. If people want to know more about it, you can find one of Mike's other podcasts, because today we're jumping right into large-scale preservation projects. And Mike, those projects present some unique challenges, which is why I am so excited to jump straight in and tackle this head on. Can you start, though, by describing one of the more complex data preservation engagements that the iDS team has handled and some of the specific hurdles that came up?
I certainly can. And the interesting thing about these type of projects is that you don't just jump right in. Unlike other forensic engagements where you might be hair on fire, or there's an investigation, or it's a particular situation where a TRO is involved, a temporary restraining order, and you have to go get devices, you're mainly dealing with just a few. And that's get in, jump in, let's go. Right. With large-scale preservation, it's typically the methodical application of forensic best practices. So you're looking at tracking and chain of custody and collection, but it's applied to hundreds, if not thousands, of devices. So what we've done is projects relating to preservation of thousands of computers. We've done the same thing for thousands of phones. We've done hundreds before. And so some of the unique challenges behind them involve logistics. Sure. It involves personnel. It involves equipment and technology, security, and that's just on our end. And then we're talking about what happens on the client end, and how do we talk to the client, get all the stakeholders on the client end to understand what we need and what we need from them.
Interesting. Sounds similar to a situation where you've got an ER doctor and maybe a surgeon. ER doctor has 30 seconds to assess and start treating a patient. In some cases of preservation, you've got to get the data while you can. Large-scale preservation is a bit more like that surgeon. You have a plan, you create the plan, you assemble the team around you to perform the surgery. Or maybe my analogy is terrible.
No, I think your analogy works well, because once you have a plan, it's a long-term strategy that somebody has to implement. Not saying that in hair on fire situations, you're not implementing that same plan, because your best practices are best practices and you apply them. But you will be pivoting on some level. So in a lot of ways, large-scale preservations is actually a lot more defined. You have a lot more ability to plan, which makes them go a lot smoother and more seamlessly than the emergency or really quick rapid response type preservations that we deal with all the time.
All right, Mike, let me ask you this question. Can you give us some examples when large-scale preservation projects might come into play?
From experience, they come into play in multiple cases. It could be a company going through a technology refresh where they're taking out old equipment and they're bringing in new equipment. So a lot of times we're working through the IT department because they're at the forefront of that. A lot of times it's dealing with HR because there are issues of either mass exodus where they're going to competitors, or unfortunately it could be layoffs. So we're dealing with HR in many respects. Sometimes it's bankruptcy proceedings. So we're dealing with that. And then sometimes just internal projects that happen at the company where there's a decision made to go from maybe one platform to another. It's not necessarily a technology refresh, but it's the same tech, but they're using maybe different management systems. So we have worked with IT, we have worked with HR, we've worked with compliance, we've worked with attorneys, because very often you could even have a litigation matter, like a class action suit, where a company's all of a sudden involved, and now there are hundreds, if not thousands, of devices that need to be preserved for a litigation matter. So various groups and different situations that we work with.
Yeah, and it seems like, based on what you've just shared, it doesn't always originate out of the general counsel's office. It can very well be generated out of some other part of the organization.
Very often, yes. And like I said, it's technology is very often the first group, or IT is the first group that is driving this, because it is technology related.
Just think about all the moving parts that are in play, and
Yeah.
the amount of buy-in and coordination that can go on as it impacts so many different parts of an organization. It's not just an IT situation. It really could affect, business operations as well.
It usually affects multiple departments. You need someone from the technical side or IT organization to provide you with information about the devices. You need procurement and vendor assessment to buy into the idea that you are the correct vendor. You need legal to approve it, or in many cases, the legal department is involved in the um, challenges that are involved in legal holds, right? And they are providing advice about why you should be preserving. In many cases, there's even a separate department that has to do with records retention. So even though people are not on legal hold, they may be under the obligation to retain records. And when you come across a device from 10 years ago, someone has to go, what's on this device? This device, going back many years prior to that, or the data on that device is going back many years prior to that, or is the device more recent? Things like that. Then you get into who are the people that are involved in logistics? Who are the people on the client side that are involved in project management and organizing their group of people? They're the in-betweens. So it typically requires 5 to maybe 8 different organizations within a company before we even get started.
And of course, all of these people have day jobs where they have what they were expecting to work on for that day, that week. And now it's, in addition to that, we've got this large scale preservation project to think about. So
that's right. And many of them didn't even realize that you would need a large scale preservation project, because, as an example, let's say you are moving offices and you come across a large building, and you need to pretty much get rid of the things in there. So you walk into this big storage room, and it's got hundreds, if not thousands, of devices, and you go,
right.
well, I don't know what's in there. Let's just get rid of it.
Right.
So the initial impact on those on the ground is typically, let's just get rid of it. We don't need it. It's old. And that's when proper management and good conversational skills and sort of knowledge of your company usually leads into a phone call that goes, hey, we found this room. What do we do about this? And then the conversation starts.
Got it. Well, that's a great it's a great transition to my next question for you, Mike, which is, what strategies does your team employ to efficiently locate and also collect data from various data sources in these types of efforts? I mean, you mentioned the building, the room, the closet, but what are some of the specific strategies that you've employed?
Well, we've looked at dividing up devices into groups. We looked into asset identification based on custodians. So out of 1,000 devices that you have in a room, not all of them necessarily need to be preserved, but you do need to understand which ones. So maybe you have to go back to legacy systems to say that the following devices or groups of devices belong to a set of custodians. Those set of custodians are on legal hold. The other ones are not. They're no longer here, so no big deal.
Mhm.
Those type of strategies. You start looking at things that uh, typically with an IT organization or with the business themselves, since the business tends to know their environment better than most, to try to understand groups of devices based on age. In
Oh,
some cases, you might have devices that were managed by a certain platform, and that platform is still available, so you can get some security things from it. In other cases, they're not. So you might go, all right, let's say I've decided to go and start this project. What are the priorities? Is the priority going to be the devices that we can definitely get because they are on legal hold and we have access to them and we have all the security measures in place to be able to get data off of those, uh, as opposed to the others that you can do in parallel, and the business can go chasing down information about people, information about security, the ability to get into those devices, and other aspects of it. So those are just some of the strategies that we employ.
Now, of course, we've been talking about devices, but what we're talking about also can apply to systems, right?
It could be absolutely. It could be systems, and devices is sort of a general term, right? A device could be a computer, it could be a cell phone, it could be a database, in my world. But um, you're absolutely right. Since preservation of legacy systems is so often critical, and a good example of these would be bankruptcy or divestiture cases, where company goes out of business, someone's responsible for picking up assets, but they are also responsible in understanding maybe how the business was run and what is owed to whom.
Mm-hmm.
And you no longer have the ability to access the same technical resources that you did before, passwords and otherwise. But here's this server or group of servers and computers, and on them are platforms and systems, all of which need to be preserved properly and in a way that you can actually access the information and get access to the analytics, or you get data so that you can perform analytics on it in order to identify what your strategy or what the business case is.
Yeah. So you've identified your data sources, your devices, um, data sets, all of that. There's got to be this balance, though, between that need for comprehensive data preservation and legal and regulatory obligations that might apply. So how do you balance that need? How does a corporation balance that need between preservation and those obligations?
Well, I think it goes to what I spoke about a little bit earlier, which is uh, not all devices necessarily have to be preserved. Um, Legacy devices, for example, but knowing what data resides on the devices or what data resides on different systems and platforms will drive that decision. If, just as an example, if a company is required to preserve records for 7 years, knowing that the earliest data or the latest data on a particular platform is 15 years old will
Mhm.
drive you to the decision that that particular system or device does not need to be preserved. The opposite of it is um, the idea that there's newer data and therefore you aren't under obligations. And there is a conversation between the business and legal and regulatory and compliance folks at the company about records retention and what each individual business is required to do. So data will drive those decisions, and regulatory landscape will drive the data side of it. So it's a partnership between us and the business to determine what needs to be preserved and whether it needs to be preserved.
Makes sense. Definitely makes sense. Now, technology's got to play a vital role in all of this. Can you talk about how the iDS team and how you have utilized technology in these types of large-scale data preservation projects?
So technology is an interesting animal because the tools that are often used are the same for what I would call rapid response situations. However, because you're dealing with a large amount of devices, security very often is paramount.
Right.
And clients will often ask to segregate data from other projects. And that could be both physical segregation, so an entirely separate lab with entirely separate equipment with different licensing, and that could include different storage, different encryption, everything that is specific to the users. Sometimes that also involves vetting the personnel that is working on those projects, because there may be some requirements that only specific people can touch certain data.
Mm-hmm.
And so we do that. And then there's, of course, in addition to technology, a human resource aspect to it as well. Because if you have the ability to plan, that means you can have the ability to dedicate. And sometimes you just dedicate your resources so the client is aware who's going to be on it. And there's a certain expectation as to, for example, the number of devices that you can actually get out in a week, so that every week you can provide a proper status report to the client. Everyone's aware of the challenges, everyone's aware of what you're going, and you're always working towards an end goal, so that both you and the client are aware whether you're going to hit that end goal or not.
This does not sound cheap, Mike. It sounds like large-scale data preservations can be quite costly. So how do you balance the need for what I would say a comprehensive data preservation plan is with cost efficiency, but you also at the same time maintain data integrity?
So I think part of it is economies of scale, and the ability to reduce costs when you're dealing with a very large amount of devices. But part of it is also a challenge of not doing it. So even though preservation is expensive,
Mm-hmm.
not preserving could be even more costly. So the challenge is, what would be your downside in terms of financial impact? Is it a fine because you didn't preserve? Is it a spoliation motion and an adverse ruling against you because you did not undertake those steps? So if you're expanding the money, which is not insignificant, but is usually lower than if you were to do a one-off preservation, then at the end of the day, you end up spending the money, but reducing your risk in ways that downstream you would spend a lot more money fighting.
I think that's hugely insightful. I think that there are times where people focus on, what is the total at the bottom of my estimate.
What is the total now
Yep.
versus what am I going to pay, in a year, in
Right.
fines or in motions and attorney fees and a lot of other financial costs that are overlooked now.
Right. And so some examples of this, would they include having devices shipped to a particular location versus devices being preserved on site?
Absolutely.
Okay.
There are times where devices need to be preserved on site. There are some
Sure.
security issues with some clients. That makes sense. But having a dedicated lab and being able to, excuse me, ship the devices to one or more labs and organizing them in a certain way allows you to have a proper intake process, which leads to proper documentation, which leads
Right.
to chain of custody. And once you reduce that, that's the first step in the preservation process.
Right.
You lead to good practices.
Yeah. And it seems like it's just also intertwined. From the outset, the planning with the teams, putting a plan in place, executing on that plan, thinking about it through each step of the process, ensuring that you still stick within the time frame that you have, and balancing it all with risk that's there.
Absolutely. It's good project management combined with proper forensic.
Great. Let me ask you this one last question. What do you like most about working on large scale preservation projects?
I like the neatness of them. I like the ability to create a process for the client that drives them to an end goal. And it is similar to running an investigation.
Mm-hmm.
Someone has an end goal. But in this particular case, you're essentially organizing chaos into manageable chunks,
Okay.
into the ability to produce reports and then give insight into data to clients, but on a much, much larger scale. And it just feels like when the world gets bigger, and the amount of information that you provide gets bigger, both I and the clients get excited knowing, look, we've done this out of this many devices.
Yeah.
And being able to just have a flow going over and over again is just a feel good project. But at the same time, we're realizing that we are applying best practices over and over and over and over again, which leads to consistency.
Right.
And consistency is where we want to be.
Yeah. Love it. Love the answer. Really enjoyed this conversation. So, Mike, thank you for joining me today on our podcast. I'd also like to thank our regular subscribers, those that also may be first-time listeners, for spending time with us. If you'd like to learn more about iDS or want to subscribe to our iDS Talks podcast, you can visit idsinc.com or go wherever you normally go to get your podcasts. If you are watching this on YouTube, feel free, please, actually hit that subscribe button. Thank you again, though, for joining us, and I look forward to talking more about data with you on the next edition of iDS Talks.